We talked a lot earlier about coverage for America's healthcare needs, but what about access to the cutting-edge treatments that could save our lives? And what if that treatment has not been fully vetted yet? You might have seen the news last week about a breakthrough new drug that's being hailed as an astounding second chance to treat leukemia relapse. An FDA panel unanimously recommended approval because it's shown such promise in early trials, despite the fact that long-term studies have not yet been completed. In fact, any patient that would be allowed to take this drug would have to be registered and tracked for 15 years if the panel gets its way with the full FDA. It's part of a controversial practice in the drug industry called fast tracking. The president declared a few months ago there should be much more of it, but not everyone thinks it's such a great idea. Joining me are Dr. Aaron Kesselheim. He's an associate professor of medicine at the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School. Good to meet you, Doctor. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Patrick Lacey, you've read about him, founder of BeatNB, which he founded to raise money for neuroblastoma research after his son Will was diagnosed as a baby with a rare cancer which had no cure. Will is now a healthy 12-year-old boy. Congratulations on that. And Pat, it's good to meet you. Thanks so much for being here. Doctor, Donald Trump said approval at the FDA is, quote, slow and burdensome. A lot of people with sick family members agree. You don't. Why?
Well, this is a common misconception. The FDA is one of the, if not the fastest regulatory agency in the world. Drugs are reviewed in an average of about 8.5 months, and 3/4 of the drugs approved by the FDA last year were qualified for one of its 5 different fast-track programs.
So why do you think the president's saying what he's saying?
Well, the president has an anti-regulatory ideology about all different kinds of government, and he's painting the FDA with the same broad stroke.
Sir, you are not as concerned about fast tracking, about speedier approvals. Why do the facts as described by the doctor here not persuade you that the FDA is doing just fine, Pat?
I think one of the challenges is that in rare patient populations, it's a different set of circumstances.
Meaning what?
A lot of the rules and regulations around FDA approval are for adult cancers with larger patient populations. When you have 350, 200 patients in a clinical trial, it's difficult and challenging to use the traditional methods of the gold standard, which is a randomized trial, which might make 10, 12 years to enroll and to see if it effectively works. And these patients don't have that time. The cost for those trials are prohibitive. It just takes too long to find out if it works. So there needs to be ways to look at things like a historical control to compare these patients to as a way to perhaps create options for these patient populations that are falling through the cracks of the current system.
So you're fine with what you call the gold standard in the traditional setting, the normal vetting process, is that correct?
Well, the normal vetting process as it stands now is what it's the proverbial round peg. The pediatric patient population is doesn't fit. And so the current process, while there are, you see these drugs that are approved for, say, a cancer, and it creates 90 days increase in survival. 90 days. And you're wondering, how does that process take place? The drug can go through all these testing and all this funding just to create 90 days of extended life.
How about these small subgroups that Pat is talking about? Isn't it reasonable in those settings to make an exception to the rule that you think is the one that should be abided by?
Absolutely, and the FDA already does that. In fact, 2/3 of FDA drugs are approved based on trials lasting less than 6 months. And for drugs that are treating rare diseases, the FDA frequently allows single-arm trials, historical controls, use of surrogate measures rather than real clinical endpoints so that people can be tested more quickly. This is a common practice right now among the FDA reviewing rare disease drugs.
On our radio show, we have Art Kaplan, who's a medical ethicist at NYU, who pretty much sides with you on this issue, has concerns. But the thing we broach with him, my radio co-host Rodrigo and I, every time we discuss this, if a family is told by someone like you what the risks are, and they understand what the risks are, and they're willing to undertake them because they're desperate, frankly, why shouldn't they be allowed to take a drug faster than you believe proper testing would dictate? You know what I mean?
Sure. And in fact, they are able to do that. There's a process called expanded access through which people can petition the FDA to allow them access to drugs that are still under investigation.
But if I may interrupt you, from what I understand, that's if you're skillful, put together a social media campaign.
Sure.
The elites of us who really know how to manipulate the system. But for the average person, that doesn't exist, does it?
Well, look, 50 years ago, the FDA's rules about the need to test a drug to show that it works and it's safe before it comes onto the market were put in. And that's because before that, there were hundreds of drugs, thousands of drugs out there that showed no efficacy, that were unsafe, and that drug companies were selling widely to patients, and patients were using based on a lot of misinformation. And so what we decided as a society is that we needed the FDA and we needed rules to make sure that drugs could be tested to show that there is some amount that they work in some way before they can be widely sold, and that's the current FDA system we have.
If you were the czar of this system, which you're not, but if you were and unilaterally could promulgate rules around this, what would you change from what currently exists? Because what the doctor seems to be saying here is there are all the exceptions that need be in place for people in extreme situations.
In those extreme situations, but you're right, it's hard to find those extreme situations where everyone has access. It's not the same access to care. And what's best for the patient is not always what is the best science. It's not always what's the best policy.
What does that mean?
We have a clinical trial right now that we brought to the FDA, 100 patients enrolled on it. Event-free survival at 2 years is 90%. Traditionally, the patients be around 67% to 70%. And we were told you have to do a randomized study. So we have to go back and then take a
What does a randomized study mean for people?
We enroll a clinical trial, patient comes on, you either get this drug or you don't. And then we compare to see at the end, a pile of dead kids on this side, a pile of not dead kids, which pile is bigger? That's the process they want us to follow for this. And we keep explaining to them, we want to use a historical control because right now, if you go to our hospital IRB and try and open these studies, they already saw the phase 2 clinical trial results. It would be unethical to open it. So we're kind of caught in this in-between of it's successful enough that the hospital won't allow us to do a randomized study, but the FDA still requires it.
You know what's amazing about this? Well, in the newspapers, in the media, there's this huge debate. Every time he says something, you're nodding your head in agreement. You, too, could craft something that would satisfy him and satisfy you. Could you not?
I think we could. Look, I don't know about the details of this particular product. All I know is about the sort of overall trends at the FDA. And the FDA approves a lot of drugs on the basis of single-arm trials, historical controls, particularly around rare diseases. The point is, after the FDA approves a drug based on that limited data, those confirmatory trials then need to be done and need to be done in a reasonable amount of time. Unfortunately, a lot of drug companies don't then subsequently test their drug in a timely fashion after the FDA does give this kind of fast-track approval.
Doctor, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Patrick, pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.